Welcome to MantleSaga, where superhero legends begin. People love arguing over which Superman is the strongest. Superman 1 million, Strange Visitor, or some future god-tier version with infinite power all get thrown into the conversation again and again. But that argument misses the point because the ultimate form of Superman was never just a man with limitless strength. It was a machine built to survive the collapse of reality itself. Today, we are not talking about feats in the usual sense, and we are not talking about another simple power upgrade. We are talking about Cosmic Armor Superman, the weapon the DC Multiverse created for its final day. That is what makes him so strange and so difficult to place beside every other version of Superman. He was not born in the usual sense, not shaped through a familiar heroic journey, and not defined by the normal arc of a man learning how to carry godlike power. He feels more like the moment the Superman idea was removed from history, stripped down to pure function, and rebuilt as a last defense against total collapse. Most Superman stories still let you see Clark Kent clearly inside the myth. Beneath the spectacle, you can still find the farm boy from Kansas, the moral center, and the man whose power matters because it is held in check by compassion. Cosmic Armor. Superman still comes from that same symbolic core, but here it has been elevated into something colder, larger, and almost unnervingly impersonal. That is why this story cannot begin with feats alone, because feats are only the surface of what this character represents. Cosmic Armor. Superman exists because somewhere beyond worlds, beyond death, and beyond even the gods, there are forces capable of tearing creation apart at the level of meaning. Against that kind of threat, the multiverse does not simply need a stronger hero. It needs a Superman built for the moment when ordinary reality itself starts to fail. To understand why such a being had to exist, we first have to understand the stage beneath him. Cosmic Armor. Superman does not stand over one endangered Earth or one collapsing universe. He stands above the entire DC multiverse, and the only way to grasp what he is to first see how vast that structure really is. In DC, reality is not one clean timeline moving forward in a straight line. It is a layered arrangement of parallel worlds, alternate histories, repeated myths, and broken reflections, all unfolding at once. The same symbols appear again and again, but never in exactly the same way. At the heart of that idea is the multiverse most readers recognize as a structure of 52 distinct universes. Some are familiar, some are distorted, and some are so radically different that they feel less like alternate settings and more like arguments about what heroism becomes under different conditions. Together, they form a living system of possibility. The main continuity is generally understood as Earth Zero, the world where Kal-El falls to Earth, where Clark Kent is raised by Jonathan and Martha Kent, and where he grows into Superman as one of the moral anchors of DC. It is also the world of Gotham, of Bruce Wayne, and of the Justice League, the version of reality most audiences think of when they imagine the core DC universe. But it is only one world among many. Other worlds twist that familiar pattern into something stranger. Earth 33 reflects something closer to our own reality, where superheroes exist more as stories than daily life, where myths are consumed instead of lived. That contrast matters because it shows the DC multiverse is not just a collection of costume swaps, but a machine of competing realities with different relationships to power, destiny, and truth. Between these worlds exists the bleed, the strange medium filling the space between universes. If the multiverse is a structure of separate realities, then the bleed is the connective force that keeps them part of one larger design. It is not empty distance, but the hidden substance binding everything together. That alone would make DC cosmology enormous. But Cosmic Armor Superman does not simply belong to that system. He exists beyond it, above the worlds, and even beyond the force that holds them together, which means the story now has to move higher, into realms where reality stops behaving like matter and starts behaving like mythology. Past the 52 universes lies a region where the logic of ordinary reality begins to break down. The worlds below can still be named, mapped, and followed through events and consequences. But beyond them, the structure of DC stops feeling like astronomy and starts feeling like metaphysics. The higher you climb, the less reality behaves like place, and the more it behaves like principle. This is where the sphere of the gods enters the picture. It contains realms like heaven, hell, New Genesis, and Apocalypse, domains that are not merely planets in space but cosmic territories of judgment, war, temptation, order, and ruin. The beings who inhabit them are not simply stronger than mortals. They embody larger ideas pressing down on the worlds below. That changes what destruction means. On Earth, war destroys cities and lives, but in higher realms, conflict can wound the deeper forces that shape existence itself. By the time a story reaches this level, the stakes are no longer just survival. They are about whether reality keeps the metaphysical scaffolding it needs to remain coherent. And yet even the gods are not the highest horizon. Beyond their sphere lies limbo, a strange boundary where forgotten things, abandoned stories, and displaced fragments of continuity drift in a state between existence and irrelevance. Limbo feels less like a destination and more like a graveyard for what reality no longer knows how to carry forward. Beyond even that stands the realm of the monitors. This is the level above the known structure, where the multiverse can be observed not as life being lived, but as a pattern being watched from outside. From that vantage point, worlds stop looking permanent and start looking vulnerable. That is the point where this story becomes truly unsettling. Because once beings exist above creation in that way, the danger is no longer limited to villains conquering worlds or gods warring over realms. The danger becomes colder than that. The possibility that those watching the story from above may stop being guardians and become predators. In older DC mythology, the Monitor was imagined as a singular being, balanced against the anti-Monitor as a cosmic opposite. Later stories complicated that idea and made it stranger, transforming the concept into an entire race of monitors born from a higher source beyond ordinary reality. They were no longer just characters within the structure. They stood above it. At the root of that vision stands the Overmonitor, often imagined as a blank and boundless intelligence encountering the multiverse like a white void touched by story for the first time. In response, it divided into lesser beings called the Monitors, each assigned to observe the worlds below. Their role appeared clinical and orderly, as if they existed to witness creation without belonging to it. Among the first of these beings was Dax Novu. He was not simply another distant cosmic observer, but one of the first to recognize the terrible flaw within the Monitor race itself. They were not harmless by nature because they could feed on the multiverse they were meant to oversee. That realization darkens the whole cosmology at once. The threat does not come from outside the system, but from its caretakers, from beings so detached from life below that observation can curdle into appetite. In a universe built on symbolism, that makes them terrifying in a very specific way. They are not monsters of rage, but intellect severed from empathy. When Dax Novu exposed this truth, the other monitors did not honor him. They buried him. Sealed away in isolation, he did not remain intact, and his knowledge, hunger, and estrangement slowly twisted together into something vampiric and catastrophic. That is how Dax Novu becomes Mandrakk, the Dark Monitor, a being who feeds on the life force of the multiverse itself. He is not merely a villain who wants to rule worlds. He is a predator who survives by draining them. And once Mandrakk rises, the crisis facing creation is no longer conquest. It is consumption. For all its impossible scale, this story turns on something deeply personal. It begins with Superman at Lois Lane's bedside, watching over the woman he loves while she lies gravely ill and barely present. In that room, all the cosmic architecture fades into the background, leaving only silence, helplessness, and the one thing Superman has never learned to accept peacefully: the thought of losing her. That is when Zillow Vala arrives with an offer so precise it feels almost cruel. She tells him Lois can be saved, that the cure exists in the bleed, but that such a cure can only be contained by beings far above ordinary reach. Help is possible, but only if Superman leaves Lois's side and enters a crisis large enough to threaten everything. This is where the heart of Superman becomes unmistakable. He does not agree because he is fascinated by cosmic mystery, and he does not chase some higher destiny for its own sake. He agrees because responsibility has always outweighed fear in him, even when duty demands personal pain. Lois matters here for more than emotional weight. She has always grounded Superman, reminding him that limitless power only has value if it protects finite, fragile lives. So when her heartbeat becomes tied to a multiversal crisis, the story quietly reveals its center. Even at the highest level of DC mythology, Superman's choices still begin with love, mortality, and refusal. By the time he says yes, the tone of the story has changed. This is no longer just an explanation of cosmic lore. It becomes a test of who Superman is when the life he treasures most sits on one side of the scale and the survival of reality sits on the other. And when he steps into that greater conflict, he discovers he is not being summoned alone. Across the multiverse, other reflections of the same symbol are being gathered as well, and together they form one of the strangest assemblies in Superman history. What Superman finds is not a team in the familiar heroic sense. It is more like a chamber of distorted reflections, alternate versions of the Superman archetype drawn from radically different worlds and histories. Standing among them is not reassuring. It is unnerving because each one proves the symbol can survive in many forms, but not all of them are noble. Among those gathered is Overman from Earth 10, a world shaped by Nazi victory, where the Superman image exists under the shadow of corrupted history. There is Captain Atom of Earth 4, whose power already feels detached from ordinary human life, and Captain Marvel of Earth 5, whose presence reminds us that the Superman ideal can emerge through wonder and magic just as powerfully as through alien destiny. Each one widens the meaning of the symbol. Then there is Ultraman of Earth 3, and his presence poisons the air around him. Where Superman stands for restraint, compassion, and responsibility, Ultraman is their inversion, a creature of domination, cruelty, and appetite. He is proof that immense power does not automatically produce heroism. It can just as easily produce a tyrant. That is what makes this gathering more than simple spectacle. It is the multiverse pulling together the full range of what the Superman symbol can become: protector, miracle, distortion, warning, and threat. It is not a council held together by harmony, but by necessity. For Clark, that must feel deeply unsettling. He's no longer just carrying his own legacy. He's standing among alternate versions of his image that expose how fragile heroism can become once history, ideology, or fear bends it off course. But even this assembly is not the answer to Mandrakk. These beings are not the final weapon. They are components in a larger design, energies and opposites feeding towards something far beyond ordinary flesh, because waiting above them is the being this whole crisis has been moving toward. What emerges is not another Superman in a shinier form. It is something far stranger, a colossal construct engineered by the Monitors as a defense mechanism for the multiverse itself. This is Cosmic Armor Superman, also called the Thought Robot. And that second name matters because it tells you immediately that we are no longer dealing with a man who simply became stronger. The Thought Robot is powered through the union of Superman and Ultraman, which gives it a disturbing symbolic logic. It does not draw from purity alone. It draws from duality, mirrored possibility, and the tension between the noblest version of the symbol and its darkest corruption. It is also fueled by stranger things than energy in any ordinary comic book sense. Memory, symmetry, probability, and possibility all flow into it, the balancing structures that allow worlds and narratives to remain intact. That is why Cosmic Armor Superman feels less like a machine and more like a mythological engine. This is what separates him from other so-called ultimate versions of Superman. He is not just a future evolution of Clark Kent, nor merely Superman with higher stats. He is Superman abstracted and rebuilt, the emblem, the body, and the purpose all retained but elevated into something almost impersonal. Stories around him suggest he exists beyond the ordinary dimensional framework containing the universes below. That does not merely make him stronger than multiversal threats. It makes him difficult to measure in familiar terms because he is no longer operating as a champion inside the system. He is functioning closer to the framework above it. Once the Thought Robot is revealed, the question changes. It is no longer who is Cosmic Armor Superman. The real question becomes what happens when a being built to answer catastrophe is forced to prove that purpose against the one predator capable of draining creation itself dry. Trying to define cosmic armor. Superman through an ordinary power list almost misses the point. Yes, He possesses the familiar language of Superman amplified to an impossible degree: strength, speed, durability, flight, and destructive energy projected with overwhelming force. But those are only the outer edges of what he really is. What makes the Thought Robot so strange is not a fixed number on a cosmic scale. It is adaptability. Whatever force, awareness, resilience, or response is required to close the distance between threat and survival, he moves toward it, as though defeat is something he was specifically designed not to permit. That idea becomes clearer in one of the most revealing details attached to him. Even while operating on a scale beyond worlds, he can still perceive something as intimate as Lois Lane's heartbeat. Inside all that enormity, he does not become blind with size. He retains precision, and his awareness still bends toward what matters most. That detail gives the character emotional coherence. Cosmic armor. Superman is immense, but he is not empty. His power does not drift away from the moral center that has always defined Superman. It still bends toward fragile life, vulnerable love, and the things that can disappear quietly while larger beings fight over abstractions. This is why he often feels less like a conventional character and more like a self-correcting principle. He does not merely overpower danger, he adjusts to it, answers it, and becomes the necessary resistance against it. At that level, Cosmic Armor Superman stops reading like an overpowered hero and starts reading like the multiverse's refusal to die. And that is exactly why Mandrakk is the enemy this story requires. A being who adapts to preserve existence can only be fully tested by something that threatens not just life, but the continuation of the whole narrative structure itself. When Cosmic Armor Superman meets Mandrakk, the fight feels less like combat and more like a collision between two final principles. Mandrakk is not simply powerful. He is a devouring intelligence feeding on the life of the multiverse, a predator for whom worlds are not civilizations to conquer, but sources of nourishment to be drained. Against that stands the Thought Robot, not as a warrior defending territory, but as the last shape of resistance the multiverse can produce. He meets Mandrakk on a scale where ordinary battles no longer make sense, and every strike carries more than force. It carries purpose, refusal, and the insistence that creation does not belong to the thing trying to feed on it. This is what gives the clash real weight. Mandrakk represents higher awareness without empathy, perspective so distant that all life becomes fuel. Cosmic Armor. Superman embodies the opposite conviction, that the greater the scale of power, the greater the obligation to protect what is small, mortal, and easily lost. And because the Thought Robot adapts, Mandrakk is facing something uniquely dangerous. Every escalation has an answer. Every impossible leap is met. Cosmic Armor. Superman is not simply harder to kill or stronger to break. He is built to keep the story from ending here. Eventually, Mandrakk falls. The Dark Monitor, the predator above creation, is beaten not by spectacle alone, but by a version of Superman stripped down to pure function and elevated into the multiverse's final defense. It is a victory, but it does not feel celebratory. A battle on this scale leaves behind something stranger than triumph. It leaves behind silence. And in that silence comes one of the most haunting images in Superman mythology: Cosmic Armor. Superman kneels before a tombstone and carves 3 words into it, not as a boast, but as an epitaph that feels larger than himself: to be continued. That tombstone is one of the clearest clues to what Cosmic Armor Superman really is. After defeating a threat that fed on creation itself, he does not stand as a conqueror or claim some place above the multiverse. He kneels, he writes, and he becomes strangely quiet, as though his purpose is already fading now that the emergency has passed. The words "to be continued" turn the scene from unusual to unforgettable. They do not read like a simple promise of return. They feel like a law of mythic storytelling, the reminder that in a universe built on recurrence, endings are never entirely secure and symbols are never fully done rising. There's something profoundly Superman-like in the stillness of that moment. Clark Kent has always been defined by service without ownership, by saving the world without trying to possess it. Cosmic Armor. Superman extends that instinct to its highest form, appearing only to do the one impossible thing he was needed for, and then seeming ready to vanish the moment that purpose is fulfilled. That gives him a melancholy grandeur. He is immense, but he is not free. He is powerful, but he is not personal in the way ordinary Superman stories are, because there is no normal future life waiting for a being like this. He exists at the edge of catastrophe, and only at the edge of catastrophe. Once the crisis ends, Superman and Ultraman separate again, and the machinery of the thought robot is no longer necessary. The abstraction fades, the impossible scale recedes, and what remains is the emotional thread that began the journey in the first place. Clark, Lois, and the meaning of what this higher form was ultimately protecting all come back into focus. That is where the final interpretation of cosmic armor Superman begins to sharpen. Because after all the Monitor lore, all the cosmology, and all the impossible scale, what matters most is not simply how powerful he was. It is what he reveals about Superman when everything else is stripped away. The easiest way to describe cosmic armor Superman is to call him the strongest Superman and stop there. But once the full picture is visible, raw strength becomes the least interesting thing about him. What makes him memorable is not just that he defeats impossible threats. It is that he reveals what Superman becomes when the myth is reduced to its purest purpose. Superman has always meant more than force. He is power governed by conscience, hope made active, protection chosen again and again, even when grief, fear, and temptation would make surrender easier. Cosmic armor. Superman takes that core and removes every ordinary limitation around it, until what remains is not simply a man with powers, but the final defensive shape of hope itself. That is why Mandrakk matters so much as a mirror. He represents what higher awareness becomes when it loses compassion, when distance turns life into fuel and perspective turns into appetite. Cosmic armor. Superman answers that with the opposite principle, that the larger power grows, the more sacred the vulnerable become. And for all the abstraction surrounding him, the story still returns to the same human center that defines Superman at every scale. Lois lives. Clark comes home. The heartbeat heard across impossible distance remains the emotional proof that none of this was ever just about spectacle. The whole cosmic mechanism only matters because there are still finite lives within it worth saving. That may be the strangest and most beautiful thing about cosmic armor Superman. He feels almost beyond humanity, yet his existence still bends around the same truth that has always defined Clark Kent. No matter how large the stage becomes, Superman is still the being who stands between destruction and those who cannot survive it alone. So yes, cosmic armor Superman may be the most powerful version of Superman DC has ever shown, the one built beyond ordinary gods, worlds, and familiar cosmic scale. But that is not the real reason he matters. He matters because when reality itself faces annihilation, the shape that rises to defend it is still Superman.